Hello and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today we'll be discussing the autism spectrum. We are joined by Professor Alison Lane from Trobe University in Melbourne. With over 20 years of experience, Professor Lane has worked as an occupational therapist, specialising in children on the autism spectrum. Hello Alison and welcome to the program.
Hi Jack, thank you for having me.
Autism Spectrum Australia has recently revised its findings on autism prevalence in Australia. The findings used to show that 1 in 100 people in Australia were on the autism spectrum, but now their findings show that actually 1 in 70 people are. That is statistically speaking over 1% of the nation's population. But what actually is autism, and is it something growing in prevalence, or are we just becoming more aware of it?
So Jack, I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer to that question is it's probably a combination of both. That we are absolutely becoming more aware of it and being able to identify some of those concerns that people with autism talk to us about and tell us about, and identifying, and we're better able as a community, I think, to recognise those. So that's certainly playing a part in the increased prevalence of autism. But it doesn't explain all of it. And so I think the general consensus, certainly within the scientific field, is that there is a genuine increase as well that's not just related to awareness, but the reasons for that are unclear at this point.
And what are some of the different types of autism on the spectrum?
So in 2013, there was quite a marked shift in the way that autism was identified and diagnosed. So in the past, prior to 2013, there were a number of different categories of autism, and one of those was Asperger's syndrome. And those different categories don't officially exist anymore under the new diagnostic criteria. But rather now there's more description based on severity of the symptoms that people experience. So there are the core issues that are associated with autism relate to difficulties with social and communication skills, and then also difficulties with behaviours that might be repetitive or persistent, to the point where that starts to impact with functional performance. So, then there are varying severities of how those symptoms are experienced. So we tend to talk about types of autism now in terms of the severity of those symptoms rather than different classifications as such.
Right, and would we still describe it as a spectrum of sorts?
I think so. I think, in fact, that's probably even more true now since the revision of the guidelines, the diagnostic guidelines, so that you definitely get this sense of spectrum. Having said that, there's that expression that you may have heard that once you've met one person, one autistic individual, you've met one autistic individual. There is a great deal of heterogeneity or variance in the way different people experience autism. And then there are some other issues that are associated with autism. So mental health issues, for example, but also learning difficulties. So they can co-occur with autism, but they affect people differently. So there's a lot of variance.
What specifically is your background and relationship with the autism spectrum?
So my background is as a paediatric occupational therapist. So I've worked clinically in a variety of settings, mostly with children and families with all sorts of developmental concerns, and also within a medical field as well, so in children's hospitals in the past as well. My interaction, I guess, or my experiences of working with children with autism and their family really come from a clinical perspective. So I have worked with children with autism in school settings, but also in outpatient type work. I came into academia in a research role about 15 years ago with the intent of really trying to firm up the evidence that we have as clinicians to support our that's where I became much more focused on working in the autism field and trying to, I guess, offer my contributions to helping make our practices more effective, but also understanding what are those functional difficulties that are of most concern.
And could you say that you've always had a passion for working with children on the spectrum?
Definitely. I enjoy my work. Obviously, it's one that's kept me engaged and interested for a long time. But I also feel that the difficulties that families and children on the spectrum bring often to occupational therapists, any trusted clinician, are tricky ones. They involve some creative thinking and problem solving about how can we work within environments that children are expected to learn in, or how or make friends in, those kinds of things. How can we find ways to help families and to help children on the spectrum to do their daily living? And so there's a lot of variance in that. As I explained, there's lots of differences in the way that autism impacts people, and so there's a lot of problem solving and thinking and collaborating that needs to happen in order to figure out what the best pathway forward is. So that I find that interesting. I don't like doing the same thing twice, so it's certainly kept me very happy in the work that I'm doing.
Does gender make a difference to how someone on the spectrum will be affected?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question, and I guess the quick answer to that is most likely. We don't know as much about what's called the female phenotype relating to autism spectrum, but again, that's something that's gaining a little bit more interest and awareness, and certainly in terms of the research field. And there is an indication that certainly females on the autism spectrum do experience their difficulties in a different way. And so some of those differences might be in the relation to how they manage anxiety and emotion regulation. There's also some thoughts that females on the autism spectrum might actually spend quite a deal of emotional energy managing their social engagement with others. So there's this term called masking or camouflaging, where the thought is that females with autism can do quite a degree of masking some of the social symptoms that they might experience, and that then the more masking that happens, then that's associated with some more issues relating to mental health concerns. So there's definitely more to discover. In terms of prevalence, females still are less likely to be diagnosed with autism than males, and I guess the question about that is that a true representation of how autism is expressed across the diversity of gender, or is it more that we just haven't got to that point where we're able to recognise the signs as easily for females who are on the autism spectrum?
You're listening to Wellbeing, and we are discussing autism with Professor Alison Lane from Trobe University. What does autism look like to someone that doesn't have it?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer that, to be perfectly honest, Jack. I think that people are experienced by each other in many different ways. But I guess there are some things that might be useful for people to be aware of that might, I guess, indicate that somebody has autism. But I think it's about understanding that everybody moves through their lives and organises their daily routines in many different ways. And I guess one of the good things I think has come of increased awareness of autism is that there's recognition that there's a lot of difference in the way people express themselves. So I think sometimes you will not, the general community will not notice anything at all. Sometimes you may notice that somebody has a preference for a particular work style or social style that is different from how they prefer to do things. So that may be that they have more sort of, I guess, preferences for the way things are organised in their life or the way that they go about their day. But, yeah, as I said, I think there's so much diversity. I think that's kind of a hard question to answer, to be honest.
According to 2017 data provided by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, over 50% of those on the spectrum had difficulties with communication, learning and social interaction. As a society, what are we doing well in terms of understanding and supporting those on the spectrum in an everyday context?
It's another good question. What are we doing well? I think the increasing community awareness about autism, I think, helps us be more tolerant as a society and as a community of differences in language and communication styles. I think these are questions that autistic individuals and their families are probably best placed to answer as well and note changes that they have seen, as they are the ones who I guess are the receivers, I guess, of community support or not support. I would like to think that as a community there isn't as much stigma associated with being or having an identity that's associated with autism. I've certainly seen that change across my professional career and even as recently in the last 5 years, where there's this real movement to claim autism as an identity and as a part of neurodiversity in the community. And I think the voices of autistic adults in particular have really led that charge. And so I think there is greater acceptance of that in the community, as that autism doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a pathway to fulfilling life and engagement in community and engagement in meaningful activities, that those things can coexist. Good question. And, I can give my perspective as a non-autistic individual and a professional in this field, but I also think that, autistic individuals and their families, have important information to provide on that question.
I actually do have Asperger's, which is, I believe is on the autism spectrum, and I think I agree with you that in terms of community, we're doing really well. I've always felt supported and that the supports were there, and I think we're certainly getting better.
That's really great to hear. I think schools are more aware, and are more tapped into certainly identifying and having conversations with families. And I'm not sure if that's been your experience too, Jack, that, again, as a professional, the conversations I have with teachers and support staff at schools, are more informed than they would have been in the past. I think that's a positive sign. I mean, obviously, there's always more, right, to be done, and I think there's still a gap between awareness and then being able to completely resource our community, whether it be at schools, whether it be employers, whether it be just community groups, to be able to fully embrace and make opportunities much more universally accessible. And I still think there's a ways to go, but obviously awareness and understanding is a good first step.
For parents of children with autism, it can be really testing and challenging at times. At approximately 22%, divorce is prevalent among parents with autistic children. What is different when raising a child with autism that parents with non-autistic children may not be aware of?
Yeah, You've got some great questions today. And you're right. It's well known and well documented that the burden of care or the degree of stress that parents of children on the autism spectrum experience, essentially it outperforms any other parenting group, including parents of other children who have other who are non-autistic but have developmental disabilities. Look, one would hope that as we continue as a community to have greater understanding and awareness of autism, that maybe that statistic will start to change, because I do think that a lot of the stress and the burden for families has been in struggling to find the support that they need, and the support that their child needs. So, and find understanding. So my hope is that, with this greater understanding, which will then, again, hopefully be followed through with the resourcing models that are needed to help schools and other places work with families and children, that maybe that statistic will change.
Yep.
But I guess, the other thing to acknowledge is that sometimes it can take a while in a young child's life to figure out or to identify, what the issues are. So families are usually very tapped into their child, and instinctually, even if they don't know what the words are to explain that. But, there's good evidence to suggest that parents are aware of differences in their child's development in the first year of life. But the average age for diagnosis or formal identification of autism in Australia is not until after 3 years of age. So there's 3 years of concern there for families before they may receive some kind of indication or pathway that they can then follow or access to supports. Now, with the introduction of the NDIS, there are certainly some supports that can be provided earlier than diagnosis, but they may not always be as well targeted as if there had been that earlier identification of, the differences that you're seeing. These are associated with the autism spectrum. Therefore, we think, these are the types of supports that might best match your needs. So I do think there's a journey that families follow where they're concerned about their child, they're concerned about the differences that they're seeing in their child, and it sometimes feels like it's a battle that they have to wage against the system in order to get those issues identified and acknowledged, and then the supports to flow from that. So I think that's a big part of it. The other thing to consider is that we know that the sorts of difficulties that are associated with being on the autism spectrum are tricky. They're burdensome, so they may affect sleep quality, which in a young child then affects a parent's sleep quality. They may affect the ability of the family to engage in the social activities that they would normally expect to, and that may then isolate the family from social supports that they would have otherwise been able to access. And it can involve, quite a big difference between what the family was, the lifestyle, if you like, the family was expecting to lead, and then the lifestyle that they are leading because of whether it's lack of understanding and awareness, or just because it's difficult to the accommodations and the supports they need to provide that child to do that type of social engagement are prohibitive for at that particular point. So I think there's a few things that play into that statistic. But as I said, I would hope that as we get better as a community in understanding and supporting families and young people on the autism spectrum, that maybe parenting burden will come down.
You're listening to Wellbeing, and we are discussing autism with Professor Alison Lane from Trobe University. In contrast to the struggles that come with being on the spectrum, there are also many successes. For example, Canadian actor and producer Dan Aykroyd has put the very existence of his 1984 screenplay Ghostbusters down to his Asperger's. More specifically, his obsession with ghosts and law enforcement. Many other well-known and much-loved people from history have also been on the spectrum. What are some of the great attributes that those on the spectrum show?
I think that's really true, and I think one of the things that has happened with increasing awareness is that a number of people who have contributed greatly to whether it's knowledge or the arts or what have you have been able to reflect on their own journeys and later in life identify as being on the autism spectrum. Look, I think one of the real superpowers that autistic individuals have is this ability to focus on detail and persist with particular issues and problems for longer than a non-autistic individual can. And the benefit of that is that it allows some tricky problems to be solved because there's that greater tolerance staying with the problem for longer. And I actually think it was, I'm going to probably not get this quote exactly right, but Albert Einstein made a comment at one point that the reason he felt he was more successful than others in solving some of these intractable problems was just that he was prepared to stay with the problem longer. So, and I think that kind of speaks to some of the strengths that autistic individuals can bring to generating new knowledge and discovering new knowledge, but also within the arts to being able to shine a light on a particular issue or portray a social issue or a particular element in a different way. And the area of research that I'm mostly involved with is in sensory issues with autistic individuals, and there is good evidence to suggest that some individuals with autism have enhanced sensory perception in certain areas, and again, that can be a bit of a superpower in terms of things like the arts, for example, but also in detecting change or detecting differences in the sensory environment that might otherwise be missed but be quite important. So, look, I think there's a bunch of different potential, strength areas for individuals with autism, and I think it's great to hear about those who have, as I said, gone ahead in their lives and contributed great things, and then be able to reflect on that and talk about how their autism may have contributed to that.
I think those are some really great points, Alison, because I know for myself, as someone with Asperger's, that I've always felt like it was more of a superpower than a burden.
Would you say it makes you a good observer of the world? Would you think
Definitely.
That's one of your superpowers?
Oh, yeah.
You see things that perhaps others don't?
Oh, definitely. I've always thought it's always made me more aware, more than anything else.
And look, I think that's such an important characteristic, such an important contribution. We can sort of power along with our own preconceptions on things. A lot of our actions are based on prior experience and assumptions. So to have people in our midst and on our teams and in our lives who have got those keen observational powers is just who can see things for what they are and notice change and not be as bound by assumption is hugely important for a lot of reasons.
Definitely. And we're almost out of time, but
yep.
Are there any points that you would like to bring up that have not yet been addressed?
I'm doing some work and hope to do more work in the next 10 years to really figure out how we can both capture that superpower of sensory perception, but also modify, I guess, or assist individuals on the spectrum to be to help them manage the sensory environments that they need to be in. And we've got some interventions that are out there that occupational therapists and others are using, and there's pretty mixed evidence, to be honest, about their effectiveness. But the real problem that we have is that we just don't have enough data yet to be able to clearly say this one looks really promising, but this one is not. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to just continue adding data so that we can make better informed decisions and hopefully get better outcomes or help individuals on the spectrum to achieve their potential.
Thank you, Alison, for shining a light today into the autism spectrum. We appreciate you taking the time.
That's not a problem. It's been a pleasure.
My guest today was Professor Alison Lane from Trobe University. Thanks for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.